My name is Michael Kelly. My background is in finance, banking, and venture capital here in Germany. I was also in the US. I used to run the Commerzbank in Chicago. I was a Filialleiter at the Deutschen Bank in Ludwigshafen. I had the most magnificent title I've ever had in Frankfurt, where I was Vorsitzender der Geschäftsführung of American Express Bank GmbH. And my most interesting experience, however, and what's applicable to us here, is having started a venture capital company in Heidelberg. I've got two projects at the moment. One is a company that has developed a saliva, or is developing, I should say, a saliva test for not only corona, but for other viruses that would have a result within 45 seconds. Another project is developing a system whereby one could identify drones, for example, over airports or over any kind of facility, and not just identify that there are drones, but actually identify which drones and which drones might be carrying potential explosives. Curiosity, what's going to happen today? I work with startups. I've always worked with early stage companies. And with early stage companies, you never know what is going to happen. And you always have to be prepared for anything. And so it's fun to see what you're going to encounter, because in many cases, what you think is going to happen is not going to happen. And that's exciting. Certainly, one needs focus. One has to focus, and one has to operate almost in a schizophrenic way of walking a line, to have the vision on one hand, what's the goal out there, but on the other side, to be able to look to details, operational details. So an entrepreneur has to maintain his vision, knowing that the path to realizing that vision is not the path that he thinks it's going to be today, but he also has to be prepared to empty the wastebasket and be the putzfrau and so on at the same time. And the one thing that is very dangerous for an entrepreneur is arrogance. Arrogance can often result in believing your own propaganda and not critically looking at what you're doing. Sincerity, honesty, openness, open to new ideas, and to be prepared to change if the market changes or if the customer orientation needs changing. I'm sure everybody has a different definition for entrepreneurial mindset, but what does an entrepreneur need to do? An entrepreneur, by definition, certainly in the early stages, will make a hypothesis. The first thing the entrepreneur should do after he makes his hypothesis is to try to tear it apart. What's wrong with it? As a venture capitalist, I would look at any number of projects coming in, any number of, I've watched probably thousands of pitches. Most of them I could dismiss, not for lack of enthusiasm on the part of the entrepreneur, but maybe they just weren't realistic or I didn't understand them. If I get excited about something, or if I got excited about something that was great, I really want to follow this. What do I do? What's the next thing I do, which is what also the entrepreneur should do? What's wrong with it? This is different from saying, how can we improve it? We want to tear it apart, because if the entrepreneur or if the financial partners or whomever at the beginning don't tear it apart, the marketplace will. The marketplace will destroy you. So it's important to really be very critical of what you're doing. At the same time, you're promoting your project. Well, one has to identify the problem, and one has to make sure that the problem identified is really the problem. And very often it's not the case. Here in Germany, Many entrepreneurs want to develop something that is perfect. They have an idea what the market is. They're sometimes very reluctant to go out and test the market with something that is less than perfect. It's the mistake of building the perfect mousetrap. We have an expression in Silicon Valley, I like it. You're an entrepreneur and you want to create better dog food. So you do all the research on what dogs eat. You put all the ingredients together, you make a nice package, but what's missing? What's missing is, and this is an expression that one uses, will the dog eat the dog food? And will the market accept what it is you're trying? So one has to build things that are going to be incorrect and constantly test, which means looking critically at what you're doing to make sure that you're fulfilling a market need. And making sure that need, you might fulfill a market need, but that the need is great enough to so that your product or service can scale. So it's large enough. There's never a guarantee. There's never a guarantee for anything. We can all be run over by a bus tomorrow, but your chances are going to be better. And your chances are always going to be better if you continually keep your customer in mind and work with your customer. Many customers will accept something less than perfect. Many customers want to be on the cutting edge of things, so they will work with you and they will help you develop your product. And if you can, this is a successful way of creating something that the market will actually want. The market is merciless. That's a very good question, and I think I'll take the U.S. first. Entrepreneurship is considered by some to be suspect. It's too easy for these kids to make money, and we're jealous of it. So it's a generational thing, I think, on both sides. But on the whole, it's acceptable, very much acceptable, and my experience has been primarily in California, in Silicon Valley, where I'm from. So there was it was everywhere. You go to a bar, you go to a restaurant. When you hear bits of conversation, 80% of the time, people were talking about their startup, the startup they wanted to have, and management issues and so on. And crazy. Also interesting there that entrepreneurship is not limited to so-called Americans in the Valley. Half of all companies are started by people not born in the United States. So a very international environment. Germany, entrepreneurship, Unternehmertum. As a venture capitalist, I found it interesting that the German term for venture capital is Wagniskapital, so which doesn't really describe it. And so even here now in Germany, we use the term venture capital. I think it's a generational thing. 30 years ago, if a young engineer or marketing person went home to mom and said, "Mom and Dad, I want to start my own company," Mom and Dad would have looked at them and said, "Isn't there a job at Siemens or Daimler or Deutsche Bahn or Deutsche Bank? It's too risky." And at 30 years ago, there was a place for them at Siemens and Daimler and Deutsche Bahn, and they could perhaps anticipate spending an entire career with a large German company. Those days are gone. It's more difficult to do that. Companies, as we know, lay people off, and so so one part of answering your question is the environment no longer supports employment for life in the same fashion that it used to. The other part of that is that younger people now are more international. The internet has made the world small. It used to be that, and English, of course, is the language of entrepreneurship. For good or for bad, it's not a political statement. And the level of English has improved tremendously because previously where people studied English in school, everybody studied it, or most people did, and they could perhaps read it, but it was Schul English. And nobody was very comfortable speaking it all the time. Now people study in English as opposed to just studying English, and that has greatly expanded their access with the internet to entrepreneurial activities that previously they would not be capable of having any knowledge of, which is a long answer to your question. But I think now entrepreneurship has become salon fait, and I think that's a good thing. And I think that entrepreneurship in Germany is reaching a point where the growth can be quite large, because there are more and more people that are interested in it. And it's not just because of the money, it's because it's an exciting activity. It's exciting to have a dream and try to realize it. Yes, there's a lot, and it has to do with the thought process. Both Americans and Germans are capable of thinking big. The difference is how you go about trying to realize that. Americans say, I want to change the world. This is not something, I mean, this sounds really strange and sometimes sounds unsophisticated and silly, but a lot of entrepreneurs really want to change the world, and they really think they can. And so they will create an idea that is perhaps outrageous, and then try to figure out a way to make it work. Even if you're not going to change the world, and you're looking at, say, raising capital for your service, and you think this is really a cool idea, there's a huge market for it, I know it's going to change things. The American entrepreneur will run a sales or profit graph like this, called the hockey stick, in the shape of the hockey stick. And on the theory that if he'll look to anywhere from 1 to 300 million in sales within a 3 to 5 year period. Talk to a German entrepreneur, and he said, I can't do this. My line goes like this. Why does my line go like this? Because I know I can get this much money from the Land. I know I can get this much money from the High-Tech Gründerfonds. I know I can get this much money from my charge cards, and so on. And this is what I have to work with going forward. The American doesn't even look at that, because he is going to go to his venture capitalist and he's going to say, I need $10 million. And he makes assumptions as to how he's going to use it to attain his 200 or 300 million goal. And these assumptions will be tested, of course, but they're assumptions. The German entrepreneurs tend to be very, very conservative in how they look at both their future results and what it's going to take to achieve them, and that hampers them. So what happens? So a venture capitalist will look at the German company that, say, has the same idea as the American company. The American company is going to realize 300 million in sales, and the German company is going to realize 50, and that's pretty good for 3 years. That's a lot. And the American is going to say, if your product is so great, why are the sales so low? So that's a big difference in how the entrepreneur puts together his program. Both of them believe in what they're doing, and both of them consider what they're doing to be realistic, but it's different. The thought process is different.
Would you then consider Americans more brave?
It's not quite, no, well, that's a brave. No, in fact, I think by definition, the German entrepreneur is much braver than the American entrepreneur. And why is that? First, you have to be crazy to be an entrepreneur in Germany. The downside risk of being an entrepreneur in Germany is much greater than the downside risk of being an entrepreneur in America. Entrepreneur in America, I start this, no, it didn't work. Okay, I learned something. So I go to raise money again, and the venture capitalist or the private investor says, well, why did your company fail? And you explain why it failed, and I learned it, and I'm not going to make this mistake. They say, okay, you learned something. You're more mature as an entrepreneur. Here is not always a sign of failure, exactly. Whereas if you fail in Germany, there are legal consequences to that, and there are social consequences to that. So the downside risk is much higher, and you're less likely to get funded again, regardless of what you've learned in the process of going bankrupt. So I admire the German entrepreneur. He's braver and deserves credit for that. The flexibility and the willingness to think big is less in Europe in general, including Germany, than it is in the US. And so sometimes you find somebody with an idea and you just want to push them. Come on, get going. And the excitement or the energy is not there as often. But I think there's a lot of things that can account for that. First, modern entrepreneurship is new. So there are fewer examples to follow. So the idea that things can actually, that you can really aim high, the experience here hasn't yet fully been proven. Although I disagree with a lot of people who say Germany is not entrepreneurial, because if you look at the history of Germany, you go back to, say, the formation of Germany, 1870, and so on, tremendous boost of rise in company activity and technology. And then you look in the post-World War II period, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder. This was more than just the Marshall Plan. This was more than money. This was people really energetic, building something. So Germany is a land of entrepreneurs, or is re-becoming a land of entrepreneurs. From the other side, from the States, what do you miss in Germany? The concept of work-life balance. The States is a tough place to operate in. The market is tough. There is no safety net, either in business or personally, and you constantly have to be working to keep your head above water. So it's not all fun and games. And Silicon Valley is not a place of magic. It's a place of brutal competition, and the name of the game is not what you're doing for society or what you're not doing for the world, although that might be on the surface. It's all about the money. It's a sort of a what have you done for me lately, and what are you going to do for me in the future, and let's see it. Do it. Do it. Because if you don't do it, you might go through life wondering what would have happened if you had done it. And that's a horrible feeling.